Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest and to our discussion, Is Wisconsin a Climate Change Haven? My name is Alexandra Tempest. I'm an independent journalist and from Wisconsin, coming to you from Los Angeles, but I visit Wisconsin frequently. I've recently been on the road on a road trip across what I'm calling uprooted America, places where people have been forced to decide to either leave or stay due to climate change impacts like flooding and fire and things like that. So Wisconsin is very much a part of that conversation, and it's part of the impulse behind this discussion tonight or today, as you'll be listening to it. So, in the context of a popular discussion, sometimes we hear or we see, headlines, such and such is a climate change haven or a climate haven, a place where we might be safer because conditions are better or might be better in a future climate scenario. There are prominent authors and experts who, demographers and geographers who have said that places like the upper Midwest are destinations. One such person is Parag Khanna, who had a book out last year, and who teamed up with the Council of the Great Lakes region to actually put out this word about the upper Midwest being a great place to live, especially in the context of climate change, citing things like temperate weather and plenty of fresh water, things like that. He even went so far as to call this an oasis and say that Michigan will be the best place to live in 2050. And then there are certainly officials that have taken that impulse and run with it. So for example, in places like Ann Arbor, Michigan, there are municipal officials who are teaming up with demographers to study things like how many people do we stand to gain in our region because of shifts in climate dynamics. But the intention behind this is often good. We want to know where we might be safer, and also in the meanwhile where we might direct more public investment. But it tends to be more complicated than that. As we saw, there were prominent articles just a few years ago saying that the Pacific Northwest was a climate change haven or could be a climate change haven. And if we look just to the past couple of summers, we've got last summer, this once in a millennium heat dome that settled over the Pacific Northwest. And the summer before that, the worst air quality in the world was measured in Oregon. And again, the heat dome has revisited that region. So that was something that was very concretely called out as a potential climate change haven, and things have been more complicated there than anticipated. And so that is the case everywhere. And we might walk away today with a different idea of climate change havens. We'll see. For now, I'm going to turn it to some of our panelists, and they're all very distinguished guests, and I'm very grateful to have them join me in this conversation. So first, I will turn it over to Daryl. Daryl, do you want to talk to us a little bit about sort of introduce yourself and then talk to us a little bit about sort of the fact that climate migration isn't happening in a vacuum. In fact, there's a lot of other trends happening in where people are moving. So we need to be aware of that as well.
Sure. So my name is Daryl Fairweather. I am the chief economist at Redfin. I study the housing market, and the housing market touches so many things, including climate change. And I've actually experienced this firsthand. So I was living in Seattle before the pandemic hit. During the pandemic, we all went remote. In 2020, this time in 2020, there was a big fire in the West, and the air quality in Seattle was really terrible. Usually red is when you're supposed to go inside, but it got to purple, and then it got to brown. It was the worst air quality in the world for an entire week. But luckily, me and my family got in our car and drove to Wisconsin because my husband is from Wisconsin, right before the smoke came into Seattle, and then we never left. So I've been living in Walworth County, Wisconsin for the last 2 years. I'm originally from the West Coast, from California, and I really like it here, and I can definitely see more people on the West Coast coming to that same conclusion eventually, but maybe my circumstances were unique. Obviously, my husband had ties to the area, so there's a lot of things to consider when people decide where to move. Family ties, costs, just in terms of affordability, the job opportunities, and climate is on the list. Redfin actually just released a study where we did this experiment where we showed a group of people flood data on the Redfin website, and another group didn't see the flood data. Now everybody can see the flood data, but when we first launched, we did this experiment, and one result was that when people saw the flood data, they ended up making offers on homes with lower flood risk. So we have evidence now that people are taking climate change risks into account when deciding where to live. That's not the number one thing people consider, but it is on the list, and it may continue to grow to the top of that list as climate change becomes more salient in people's minds and they have their own firsthand experiences with climate disasters.
And is it right that we're seeing a lot of people move to places like the West where there is a lot of drought and the South where there's coastal hurricane risk?
Yes. So the top migration destinations are in the Southwest, so like Arizona, Texas, Florida, and some of the Southeast, like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and all those places tend to have higher risks. In the Southwest, it's drought. In Florida, it's like everything. It's heat, it's storm, it's flood. But yes, they have higher risks. The lowest risks tend to be in cold areas. But it seems like people prioritize warm winters or mild winters over, the unbearable heat in the summer. And I think part of that has to do with adaptation. There's air conditioning now. 50 years ago, people wouldn't have considered living in Phoenix the same way they do now.
Right. Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the specific Wisconsin concerns when it comes to how things have evolved recently and how things are, projected to change in the future, Larry, with precipitation being sort of the top concern in Wisconsin. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it might be helpful to get a picture of flood risk in Wisconsin. For example, if we look at how...
Also interrupt to ask you to please introduce yourself. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to do that. Sorry about that. I'm Larry Larson. I'm a civil engineer by background. I graduated from Platteville and worked in California for 5 years on the California Water Project, the large oil dam moving water down into the Central Valley for irrigation and into Los Angeles for water supply. Came back to Wisconsin and ran the dam safety programs, the floodplain management programs, wetland programs, and various other programs for the state of Wisconsin for 30 years. And I'm a founder of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, executive director in the past, and now director emeritus. The organization has about 20,000 members nationally, and state and local, etc. So my background is, I have a heavy background in flood risk. I work a lot with Congress and the White House, have with every president since Ronald Reagan. And we try to work on national policy to make it work at the local level so that people and communities can become more resilient. So let me get back then to my original point of mapping to say, how do the people of Wisconsin know whether they're at flood risk or not? Are we, in fact, a haven from climate change? The reality is, if you were to make a flood map, and in fact, all flood maps in Wisconsin and the nation are made this way, you start off by calculating what's the 1% chance rainfall. In other words, 100-year rainfall. And you take that rainfall event and you put it on that watershed, and you do the calculations to figure out how much water runs off and how high the flood levels will be and all that. And that's what makes the flood map. Now, over half, and probably 80% of the flood maps in Wisconsin use the when you make the map, you start off with getting the 1% rainfall. Well, that's put out by NOAA, and it's called Atlas 14. So the book tells you, here's how much rainfall you can expect in 24 hours, that 1% chance rainfall in Wisconsin. The prediction was that it would be 6 inches in 24 hours. That data stayed the same until 2013. NOAA put a new atlas out that said, by the way, it's now changed. It's gone up 33%. Instead of 6 inches in 24 hours, it's 8 inches in 24 hours. Now, unfortunately, 80% of the maps in Wisconsin are based on the old data. Even the 2013 atlas, which said 8 inches, was based on data from earlier than 2010. So you can see that when we look at our flood maps in Wisconsin, we really aren't seeing true flood risk. It doesn't take into account these extreme events that we've seen recently. The 2018 flooding here in the Madison area, that was probably a 1,000-year flood event. That's not in the data yet. So if you were to get that data and try to do maps for this area, you'd have to update all that data. And NOAA is just now starting to update the Atlas 14s nationwide. We finally got some funding for them, and they're proceeding with that. But it'll be 5 years before that new data becomes out. So you can see that there's lots of things that go into this. The next thing NOAA will do is not only will they update based on current data or past data, but they will also do projections of what future 1% rainfall events will be based on a lot of the IPCC stuff and so on, so that we get a sense of what are the future levels that we can predict. We see this trend is going upwards. If we look better at the last 20 years instead of the last 100 years, we're going to get a much higher number. So doing future projections is very important, and NOAA will be doing that, and that's very important. As we filter in this new data, these new extreme events, we'll see higher elevations. We'll see bigger flood maps. And hopefully we can, as Daryl talks about, we can get information to people so they make better decisions. People do not understand risk well at all. Most people do not build a house. They buy a house a developer built, but the developer talks to community officials that they're doing so they could get real estate tax revenue. And result is people buy what's available. So helping them understand risk and how it should factor into their decisions, as Daryl talks about, is very important. We can talk about that a little more. I'll come back to some of that later on. You probably want me to move on for now, and then you can come back to me later on, okay?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a couple questions brewing from that already, but yeah, no, really interesting points, well taken, that even for a place that's relatively shielded from things like hurricanes and whatnot, and wildfires, we still have our share of climate risks. And in fact, there's more climate risk to go around than maybe even the public realizes on the ground in Wisconsin. Not only climate risk and not only environmental risk, but another thing that makes a haven is are the social factors and sort of the socioeconomic conditions of such a place. So I guess I wanted to turn to Mril and talk about sort of the work that you've done with various populations in Wisconsin and how they are adapting. Oh, you're muted.
I thought I had hit that button, but I was a little hasty. Anyway, thank you, Allie. I'm super happy to be here. So I'm a geographer. I'm currently a researcher with the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, looking at regenerative agricultural practices around soil health. And I must say that farmer interest in alternative practices, including I look at cover crops, but a range of alternative practices really shot up dramatically in the wake of some of those extreme precipitation events because people had not seen anything like it before, and it really impacted farmers across the region in terms of how they were, what they were seeing and how they knew how to manage things. So they were looking for new ideas. And I'm also author of a book, Loving Orphaned Space, The Art and Science of Belonging to Earth. It's a new book out this year with Temple University Press. And as a geographer, I look at social networks, the kinds of relationships that we build with ourselves and with other beings and things, and relationships that shape practices, policies, and narratives about how we get along in the world and our environment. And this book was really an attempt to try to record some of the remarkable work that I was seeing going on in communities around the country, as well as to try to put on the table more good ideas. Because climate change, as crises tends to do, offers enormous opportunities for change. And one of the questions is, can that change benefit diverse groups of people and not only a small group of people who are already well off and advantaged? And the tendency with climate change, which is a very large, complicated problem, is to sort of stick to very large scale solutions. And also, I think a lot of our shared narratives have really we tend to very much dwell on what is being lost, what we have lost, what we're going to have to give up, and how we're going to suffer. And I really wanted to get another set of ideas on the table, not at all to sweep the concerns out of the way, but to try to kind of build our idea bank and to acknowledge ways that people are already at work trying to respond to climate change, which, as we've already talked about, is going on right now. But to respond to other challenges, many of them centered on inequity, but problems with mental health, really taking on the challenge of like food sovereignty and cultural identity, neighborhood walkability, biodiversity. There's all these reasons where and entry points for communities and people to generate a kind of range of solutions to things, which in many, many ways can help respond to crisis around climate change. And I think also really expand what is a haven, and how can a haven be that for everybody. So one of the things that I do in the book is to sort of try and get us to see what is all around us and disregarded. And this notion of orphan space is really that in most cities, in fact, around the globe, some 24 to over 45% of cities are urban open space. And much of it is involved in infrastructure. So we're talking terraces, right-of-ways, drainage ditches, stormwater basins, the little bits and pieces of land next to developments, and also pollution containment, brownfields and other things. And all of this land is involved in various ways in our infrastructure. And many people are kind of revisiting this and saying, what else could happen in this? And so this huge amount of territory is in some ways coming into our sites, I think, driven partly in climate change. But my book sort of says that there's an opportunity to see all of this space as a huge collection of kind of individual opportunities, and that every one of these spaces around us offers a new way to interact with Earth. And I have the case studies are kind of art, science, community related. And what comes out are not just the new relationships they build, but in fact, people develop new technologies. And art science collaboration is one of the ways that people develop new, more regenerative technologies, which help handle things like stormwater and growing food in new and different situations, and creating shade and lowering urban heat island impacts and that sort of thing. And there are, I don't want to go on and on about the book, but there's some takeaways here that I wanted to share that I think can be kind of useful for us in general as we're kind of thinking about one of the responses to crisis and what makes a haven. And so one of the things I say in the book is that it's important to sort of occupy your place, get outside, look around, and be there, and talk to people, and also recognize the diversity that is probably all around you. Also, once you start seeing a place as separate and different, and you kind of have to defend it. And this is kind of a tension with green infrastructure, because frequently there are community ideas about what could happen in space that have to be articulated and defended, and people need to organize themselves and collectively respond to sometimes to some top-down assumptions about what might be best for these spaces. In the projects that I looked at, there was also inequity does come up frequently. And so there are opportunities in these spaces to sort of center voices unrepresented. People who are frequently pushed out of conversations or not accessible have opportunities when you look at neighborhood spaces to participate in conversations and to really shape things. So there's a lot that cities and towns can do at this level in terms of transparency and zoning, supporting neighborhood groups, and money for training and other kinds of things that we can talk about. But I will just conclude by saying that I think if we slow down and take a look at what's around us, there are many opportunities, especially if we're centering inequity, to kind of build on what we have, and realize that there are kinds of new technologies and new connections that we can make with what's around us to help us contend with what is likely going to be a big amount of change, and much of it discomforting.
Thanks so much, Rel. Yeah, I think that it's so great to sort of make connections across, sort of these disparate disciplines here. And I think I can tie some of this all together, by talking a little bit about how some places, some municipalities, including places in Wisconsin, have decided to respond to flood risk, and by actually engaging with, re-engaging with their locality, re-engaging in where they are, stopping and taking a look around, as Merle says, and investing in where they are. And so that requires me to back up a little bit and talk about climate migration and how that works. So just briefly, we hear about climate migration. We hear sometimes the term climate refugees, but really what we know from the research is that most climate migration is internal. It happens inside national borders, not across. And that we also know that, if people can, not only do the people like to stay inside their own country, people like to stay inside their own town if they can, And so sometimes what migration looks like is moving across town, moving to the other side of town. In the case of several villages in Wisconsin, in what's called the driftless region of Wisconsin, that I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with, there are several villages that have decided to, because they've been repeatedly flooded over and over and over, and are experiencing population loss and loss of services and things like that, they have decided to plan out new neighborhoods, new, create tax incentive districts to plan new neighborhoods that people can move to. So it still is a migration, just a really small one. And so sometimes that gets forgotten when we see sort of splashy stories sometimes on like NPR or wherever that so-and-so are moving to Maine or, making big cross-country moves. Daryl mentioned earlier her own cross-country move, and those certainly do happen. They tend to be people who are maybe young professionals, people who are retirees, who are at a point where they're deciding to move anyway, and they have the financial privilege to do so. So that does happen. But I think the vast majority of the climate-driven movement are people that are slowly drifting out of their neighborhoods in floodplains, people slowly drifting, and we're seeing a lot of, again, it's not in a vacuum, we're seeing a lot of counteracting movements of people moving to the Sun Belt and to the drought-ridden areas. But then there are some populations where, like the people of Paradise, California, who moved to Chico. It's not that far away, but their town was wiped out, so they had no choice. But it's not like the vast majority of them moved to Seattle or moved to Wisconsin or moved to they all moved to Chico. Most of them moved to Chico. So, and there's other examples. Now, there are times when there are exceptions when there are big movements, long distances. And by big, I mean lots of people moving long distances. When it's a disaster scenario, for example, like a hurricane, rapid onset, major cataclysmic event like Hurricane Katrina, about 40,000 people ended up moving permanently to Houston in the aftermath of Katrina. But that was only a fraction of the originally, I think it was 250,000 that went there. So again, even in the case of Hurricane Katrina, 250,000 went to Houston for immediate refuge, only 40,000 stayed permanently. So, even in cases where we do see mass movements of people longer distances, it's an exception rather than the rule. Another example of that is Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. When that hit, there were people on the island in Puerto Rico, which is a territory. So folks came to the mainland. A lot of people went to Florida, but there's one example. A lot of people went up to Holyoke, Massachusetts, of all places. It's a longstanding Puerto Rican community up there. And so there was a movement of people from Puerto Rico to Massachusetts. And that ended up being several thousand. So those long distances of many people do happen, but they are not, I would say, from what we know so far, necessarily the vast majority of like the climate influenced movement, which is more like these slow movings of our municipalities away from danger prone areas, and which again are colliding with things like way more development in wildland urban interface. So on that point, I was gonna go to Daryl, because I know your colleagues at Redfin have just released some research about building in the WUI, as it's called. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we just did some research into where the new construction is going, and similar to the migration patterns of where people are moving, most of the construction is happening in places that are not climate resilient, places like the Southwest, Florida. Part of it has to do with land policy, that it's easier to build in some of these places, like it's easier to build in Arizona than it is in San Francisco, even though San Francisco has a much nicer climate. So it's unfortunate that we're moving in that direction, but hopefully with more awareness of climate risks, that will change. But it's really hard to predict the future, because it's hard to know, like, if Phoenix, for example, is just going to be a place where people resign to be indoors most of the time, like it is in Dubai, for example. Hard to imagine that working out for Florida, though. But I don't like to get too ahead of myself predicting where people are going to want to live, because it's not just the outdoor climate, it's also the indoor climate and how well cities adapt. And there are plenty of cities that like seemingly would have resilient climates, but don't, because the infrastructure isn't there to even meet the challenges that they're facing. So the investments that we make from here on out are going to make a large impact. And the new construction does tend to be more climate resilient. Like if it's going in a fire-prone area, they tend to build those homes with metal roofs and be more aware of how to mitigate against the risks than with the older homes. So at least that's a silver lining.
Yeah. So what are some of those places, I'm curious, that are, maybe temperate, but they aren't as well adapted infrastructure wise?
So, Chicago is an interesting example because I mean it's in the Great Lakes region, but it's built in a place that it's like would have been a swamp otherwise. I'm not a geographer, so I'll let Muriel tell us about the geography of Chicago. But from what I understand, the fact that the Chicago River flows in the opposite direction, it was only engineered to be able to withstand certain amounts of rainfall or certain elevations in Lake Michigan. So Chicago floods really easily, especially the south side, because there wasn't as much investment in the infrastructure because of redlining and historical discrimination. So even though Chicago doesn't have like all that much of a different climate than Wisconsin does, or at least southeastern Wisconsin where I am, the way the city was built might not be so resilient to swings in temperature and flooding and precipitation.
Yeah,
Can I
absolutely.
follow up on that?
Yeah, sure thing, Merle. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, no, I just really appreciate you raising that, Daryl, because I have a case study in Chicago looking at actually infrastructure and equity, but around abandoned gas stations, which again, just disinvestment, but redlining, other things mean that redevelopment of gas stations doesn't happen in certain parts of town. So you see that infrastructure just sit. And the technology for cleaning it up is actually incredibly cheap and incredibly accessible. It's just not very much developed or invested in. It involves phytoremediation, where you plant plants to dismantle hydrocarbons in the soil is one way that this can happen, but it's not really developed because it doesn't make money. But it is, I just wanted to throw that out because absolutely, as pressures around real estate and other things, the kind of existing inequities in that fabric of infrastructure have a lot to do with what people are experiencing now and already.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think I wanted to get back to Larry about, and connect to a little bit about what Daryl was talking about. There is this, there's this building happening in the wildland urban interface because that's where land is cheap. Land is cheap there, so we're building there. In other places, like in more temperate climates, we're building in one of Larry's colleagues, he likes to call the cornfields and cow pastures. But the cornfields and cow pastures of today, are tomorrow's subdivisions, right? And yet 2/3 of the floodplains in the country, right, are not yet mapped. Is that right, Larry?
That's correct. We mapped about 1/3 of the 3 million miles of floodplains in the United States. I'd like to talk a little bit about the good and the bad of what we've done to manage flood risk in the United States. Actually, some of the good is here in Wisconsin. We've talked about the retreat we've been doing in numerous areas. I worked with Soldiers Grove back in the 70s, the first major relocation project in the nation that was done. We managed to go to Washington often enough to haggle some money out of HUD, thanks to Senator Proxmire and Nelson, and get that done. And then we're following up Wisconsin's mitigation programs. Try to do relocations. We don't try not to call it retreat because people seem to hate the word retreat. Planned relocation may be a better term. But Gates Mills, the state mitigation program focuses on trying to help people get out of high risk areas. And you have to stay within the community. And that's an important part because communities don't want to lose their tax base. So, one of the communities that does it really well in Wisconsin is Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District. They not only have taken their old concrete lined channels and converted those into nature-based approaches, taking out the concrete and actually using nature to help reduce flooding. They go into the watersheds above their area and do work in the watersheds to help them reduce the risk in the city of Milwaukee and the whole metro area. So MMSD has done some really good stuff under the leadership of Kevin Schaefer and the crowd down there. I'd like to talk a little bit then about nationwide. Probably our biggest failing of the National Flood Insurance Program has been, it was designed by Gilbert White to actually help people avoid flood risk and avoid developing in high-risk areas. The NFIP has existed for 45 years, 50 years, I guess now, 68. And frankly, there has been more development in high-risk areas than there has been in low flood risk areas. That's kind of started before sea level rise, for example, because people wanted to be next to the water in Florida and the coast and so on. And then it continues despite sea level rise happening and people saying, I'm only going to be here 20 years anyway. I'll be gone before the sea level gets that high and so on and so on. But we're not doing a good job of avoiding development in high risk areas. That's probably the biggest failing we've had in the United States. So there's a lot of work to do. We're doing some of it. I like a lot of what we're doing here in Wisconsin, but it needs to be community-based and building those networks that Merrill and Daryl both talk about. So helping people do that, helping communities adapt and understand where they're going in the future, and help community officials understand that tax base can't be everything. You got to worry about protecting your future residents if they're going to be, if your community is going to be resilient. I'll turn it back to you then.
Yeah, no, great points. And I wanted to make those too about sort of those relocations that I had mentioned. And Larry talked about Soldiers Grove in particular, which was sort of the first, one of the first, tied with maybe one in Nebraska, but one of the very first ones that was a municipal relocation due to flooding. And so that's one of the reasons that Wisconsin remains a leader, is because of the Soldiers Grove project that Larry was involved with back in the 70s, is already in the local imagination as, hey, relocation is a possibility. It's happened here before. And so I think that's one of the reasons you see, a half dozen towns now deciding to do similar projects. But one of the things that relocation does is, yes, it is still climate migration. It is still people moving in response to a climate factor. Or at least including climate factors, but it is not, it is a way for communities to prevent the loss of their residents. So, it's a way for them to guard against that and retain not just their tax base, but community cultural continuity and things like that.
Let me interrupt you a second, Allie, because the Soldiers Grove, the Corps of Engineers came in and said, we'll build you a levee because the dam upstream in Lafarge is too far up and you'll still flood no matter what the dam is there or not. And we'll build you a levee. And Soldiers Grove said, no, thanks. All the levee does for us is turn us from a run-down, dying community subject to flooding into a run-down, dying community not subject to flooding. That's all it does for us.
Right.
We want to rebuild the community. We want to build our tax base. We want to expand and help our people become resilient, and that doesn't do us any good. So, and that kind of same thing happened in Prairie du Chien. You've all been out to the 4th Ward where Villa Louis is. Well, there used to be 150 homes on that island. Corps of Engineers says, we're going to build you a levee to protect that island. Prairie du Chien said the same thing. We don't want a levee. We can't afford to maintain it. So we worked with the Corps of Engineers, relocated those 150 homes. The city bought land elsewhere up on higher land, and they put developments up there, and people moved their house up if they could, or they built a new house. They helped them do that. So that's the kind of thing that helps people in the community now be viable.
Merrill.
Yeah, thank you. I just was also thinking a little bit more about development. And you had mentioned Houston, and, again, to think a little bit about the issue of equity and how to support people who, end up frequently more disadvantaged by crises. But Hurricane Harvey, hit Houston really, really hard, of course, but the people who ended up really suffering more were folks in developments where, because, taxpayers in Houston pay for a lot of the development. Like with the roads, there's all kinds of tax breaks and other things. So that development's pretty heavily subsidized. But long-term investments in infrastructure are really uneven. And neighborhoods that are poor don't tend to get the kind of maintenance infrastructure and the levees and the protection against stormwater. So when the flooding happened, it disproportionately impacted people in Houston who were of color and also people who were poor. And so, of course, the aftermath then is that when it's time for people to move, or when they have to move because nobody will build there and they can't recover their home, they have fewer resources to go ahead. So it seems like there's this pattern, as you say, and so within certain communities, people come up with these like individual strategies, but at the same time, there are these patterns of how development happens and then how infrastructure isn't supported along lines of class and other sort of inequitable structures. So, that I think have to also be addressed.
You're absolutely right, Meryl. In fact, in Houston, it was the poorest people who had to sell our house immediately. And a flipper came in and flipped it. And before the community could get new regulations in place based on new flood levels, they just redeveloped the house, fixed it up, and sold it at a profit. So the house flippers made money off the poor people. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, there were, and to tie some of these threads together, because we're getting close to time, so I'll tie some things together and then I'll turn it to everyone for last comments. But it's, yes, you're absolutely right, Muriel. In Houston, even after the initial wave of welcoming people from New Orleans, there was internal strife in Houston, people in the wealthier white neighborhoods, talking about those Katrina people and Katrina refugees. We're talking about American citizens in their own country living in another city that they are, one state away. So this is just because we're not talking about crossing national borders doesn't mean that like climate migration inside the U.S. will involve, these questions of equity and questions of making sure that there's justice in the way we adapt. And to that point, and to touch on what Larry was saying about these relocations and about this needs to be community based. And absolutely, that's another thing that all the experts agree on, that these relocation plans that I've been talking about are not, or managed retreat as they were sometimes called, although yes, the language is starting to shift way away from that. People do not like that term at all. It's more like supported relocation, or community driven relocation is more like what's out there right now. But instead of coming in, swooping in, technical experts coming in and sort of imposing plans, there's this sort of a shift in thinking now among practitioners and people in this sphere, that we need to go to the community, work with them one-on-one around the outcome that they are wanting. And sometimes that will be managed retreat, certainly in areas on the coast and places in riverine communities where they're just repeated flooding. And sometimes it won't be, but working with them to identify the outcome and then work from there to get there, and working really hand in hand with the community on that plan, because top down just is, it's been disastrous in other applications. But so I guess with that, and I just thank you all for bringing such really just fascinating points. And I think this has just been really educational for me, and I hope for our audience is, I'll just kind of spin around the room if there's any last point anyone wants to make. Daryl, I can start with you.
Sure. So I the point I'd like to make is climate change is inevitably going to make housing more expensive, and housing is already really expensive. So we need to plan for that. We need to prioritize building more affordable housing, dense housing, climate housing that is green because it reduces carbon emissions and also is resilient to the changes in the climate. And we need to do it in a way that's equitable. And that's a very big challenge, but I'm glad we're talking about it.
Thank you. Muriel, any last words?
Sure. Thanks again. Thanks to everybody and Allie for pulling us all together. This was great. I think we could easily go for another 45 minutes. And in particular, I wanted to put maybe a plug-in for us to think about art in infrastructure. And I was finding myself thinking about art in managed retreat, I think was the phrase. But essentially, there's a huge need and opportunity to sort of engage more.
I mean, it was bad enough when you had to rebuild your house after it got flooded. Now, the floodplain has changed because flood levels went up and we have more extreme events into the database. And now all of a sudden, I thought I could afford this house, but now you're telling me I got to buy flood insurance at a cost of $4,000 a year. I can no longer afford it. So these kinds of things are happening all the time. And equity builds into this issue, and having the right flood risks to begin with is very important. Let me end there.
All right. Thanks again so much to all of you and to our viewers and to the Cap Times. All right. Thank you again. Bye-bye.